Welcome to 15-Minute Fundraising, raising money broken down in 15 minutes or less.
15-Minute Fundraising is brought to you by Blakely, your partners in fundraising and marketing, helping nonprofits break down barriers and get to the good stuff through integration and authenticity.
And we're your hosts, Waja and Maeve Strathy. What up, fundraisers, and welcome to 15-Minute Fundraising. My name is Waja.
And I'm Maeve Strathy.
And today we're going to be talking about content. Now, look, content is a pretty big subject and can be pretty daunting. It's general, there are a lot of channels, there are a lot of opportunities, and so tackling something like content in, 15 minutes is a pretty challenging task. But I want to start by looking at this from a very specific lens, and that's who owns the content? Where does that content come from? And who owns the content consumption experience? Because see, in the past, a lot of it would be in the hands of the content producers. Whoever it is out there who's making content can also determine where that content is shown. And that in turn connects with how the audience can consume it. And in the days of direct TV or old school radio, that was very much tied to time and channel. But that, with the advent of things like social media, has fundamentally changed. And I would almost posit that nowadays, the content experience is very much owned by the content consumer.
I would have to agree on that. Now that we can produce our own content with ease constantly, and when I'm talking content, it's as much as writing a tweet. That's putting our content out into the world, or starting a blog if we want to take it that direction. But now that we can produce it and that's not something that kind of comes from on high, I think we view it with a much more critical lens. And so therefore, it's not really ownable in quite the same way that it used to be by, again, the organizations, corporations who are feeding it to us. Instead, we see stuff and we say, I could be putting this out there. And so we start to look at it a little bit differently. And I think we need more from content now. So in terms of who owns it, it does seem to be the person actually consuming it. And they're looking at it a lot differently than they were, say, 20 years ago.
For sure. But I think we can all kind of admit to ourselves that when it comes to nonprofit, we can be a little behind the times. Because even if you think of DM at its core, right, it's highly controlled. It's storytelling that comes out at a specific time to a specific set of people and requires real dedicated attention to consume the content, which is something that, the for-profit world has kind of shifted away from for some time.
Right.
And for us in nonprofit, we're so reliant on storytelling that it's almost like concerning on a level that we're still operating under the model that we control the entire content experience, when the reality is we have consumers out there who are connected to cause who maybe want something a little different.
100%. And so I think that's what brings us to what is the content itself. And it's funny, I looked up the definition of content because, like you said at the beginning, it's a very broad word. It's a very kind of overwhelming,
100%,
very open and almost ambiguous. And really, the definition I found is it's what's in something. Content is the makeup or what's inside something. And I think that now because of that critical eye that we're bringing to content, because it's something that we can produce with ease, and that our attention spans are decreased, to your point around direct mail, and our willingness to actually sit down with something and consume only it. We've got a lot of challenges. And so what that content actually is becoming increasingly important. I would argue especially for charities, but not exclusively, of course. But I start to think about things like relevance. How relevant is this content to me? Because if I'm going to receive a direct mail appeal, to you kind of riff on that example, I'm going to want to be reading something that I care about. I'm going to want to be reading something that touches me, that connects with me emotionally. And ideally, if we're doing our jobs as fundraisers, that content is also going to trigger some kind of action, ideally, in the form of a gift, or at least deeper engagement in the organization. So what the content is critically important these days.
So that, of course, raises the immediate question, what makes good content? Because, look, nonprofit is nonfiction.
Right.
Meaning that unlike many in the for-profit world, we can't just up and design a narrative designed to connect with our customer base, whoever that model happens to be. We're working off of real stories of real people within our population or the people surrounding them that we're then leveraging to connect empathetically to a community of supporters who are expecting action from, which makes this, I mean, for me anyway, more exciting, but also a bit more of a complex scene.
Big time. And if any, both of us have worked at charities before we joined the team at Blakely, and I think both of us have had that challenge that I know fundraisers out there have, which is there's a lot of barriers to that content, because in most organizations, there's the people who do the work of the actual mission, and then there's the fundraisers who work, super hard to raise money to allow that mission to actually be achieved. And those groups are really siloed in a lot of cases. In smaller charities, maybe they work a little more closely together. The bigger the charity gets, the more likely those groups are siloed. And it's the programs people, the people who are on the ground doing the work and meeting the mission, that often have access to the content, but they don't necessarily know that what they're experiencing, what they're in front of, is content. So how do we start to bridge that gap? That's a really, really big challenge in fundraising, because I think people are starting to get there in terms of the need for content, but how to get it, they're still seeing more obstacles in front of them than there are opportunities.
Well, I think part of the weird scene around content is kind of the same weird scene you see in nonprofit around the discussion on brand.
Yes.
Especially if you have not-for-profit organizations that aren't deeply involved in the process of branding and managing brand. Brand can be a difficult conversation because, I mean, nonprofit and the charitable sector is so couched in the emotion behind how we go about telling a story and the mission that things like brand or content production almost seem like a dirty word or dirty words depending on who you're speaking to and how they've come about to that sector. At the same time, you also need to tie it to action and donation. And there's a big part of content production that is, as you said, all about facilitating deeper connection to cause, not necessarily about immediate action.
It's absolutely true. And I think, there needs to be space made for all of that kind of content. And I think there's kind of two things here. There's first, the need for teams at charities to work together to have a shared understanding of the importance of content, how to find it, what it looks like, what it's needed for, why it matters to you, the programs person. Why should I share this story? Because, especially with sensitive causes, perhaps a social services cause, where there needs to be more anonymity around the clients or beneficiaries, however you like to refer to them, of your work. And so if there needs to be a little more sensitivity there, that's another thing that program staff, I think, get really protective, and it's coming from a good place, but they become actual barriers to content. And we have to break those down by actually, much like content, making it relevant to the program staff and giving them a reason to care. And then to your point, when we can actually access that content, what kind of content do we need for deeper engagement versus a more immediate action? Are those the same? Are they different? These are the things that we're starting to think about, and we kind of have to start to plot out, because we haven't even started talking about channels and all the many channels and different ways that you can communicate out that way, or the forms, the shapes that your content can take. Before you even get there, you need to first get past those barriers internally and the silos that get in the way, and then you need to start to think about, okay, what can I actually do with this now?
So there are kind of like two practical routes that I think we can go down with this, right? And I think they speak directly to the two levels that you talked to here, right? There's the initial concept of how do we get buy-in to the idea of content altogether? And then, of course, there's a second level. Now that we have buy-in to content, how do we now take that and distribute that over real quote-unquote channels to get our content, our information, our stories out to a wider audience of supporters and even potential supporters? Right. So, I'm going to ask you the first question, right? On the fly, if you were to make a case to a charitable organization, let's make it a little easy and say we're not working with vulnerable populations here. Okay. Right? So, if you're making a case for active and intentional content generation within an organization, what would that case be? And we're speaking from a standpoint of people who aren't necessarily bought into the idea of big brand for charities.
Right. Yeah, it's a really fantastic question. At the end of the day, every charity is out there because that there's a need that they're filling. There's a problem that they're solving. So that's our baseline. We know that can't be done on goodwill and blood, sweat, and tears only. There needs to be some money available. And so we've got the need for the program, the people who are actually solving those problems directly with their work, and then we also see the need for the fundraisers. So great, we're there. So how do we inspire people to give money? I mean, this is getting to the root of fundraising, but to look at it in terms of the kind of content framework that we're discussing within, we need people to connect with the problem and to see themselves in the solution. And how do we do that? Frankly, it's through stories. And because the act of giving, there's some rational thinking involved in it to a certain degree, to actually type in your credit card number at the end of the day. There's a rationale kind of element there. There's a place for your, is it the left side of the brain or the right side of the brain that makes the more analytical decisions? I think it's the right.
You know what?
I think it's the right.
I'm going to go with the entire brain.
Actually, you know what? I think it's the left because I think it always surprises me. Anyway, we'll move on from that. Neither of us are doctors or scientists, as you could probably tell.
There's a reason I went into marketing, and it's so I didn't have to make medical decisions.
So there is that element to it, but more than that, it's emotional. And in order to connect with people emotionally, to build empathy in people, to have them really truly connect with us, we need to tell them a story. We need to connect them with an individual person in many cases that brings to life the problem so that it's not just being talked about in facts and figures and statistics, that there's that human connection. And that's what really starts to open people up to connecting with causes. And in order to do that, we need to have real, authentic stories to tell. And I think, the people working in the programs, despite that maybe protective nature or being an obstacle for all the best reasons, I think, to talk to them about how they can help make that case and that we can be sensitive around it and we can work through it in a way that feels authentic to the organization. But at the end of the day, it requires opening up those stories to share. That's the only way people are going to start connecting.
No, see, I bought in. I'm in.
All right.
I'm in.
I did my work.
But now, let's take it one step further, right? Mm-hmm. Once we get buy-in, that's step one. But content production is a daunting task.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we have independent producers everywhere with infinite channels. So, if you were to break it down into, I don't know, almost a tier system of the main channels that...
Right.
that a new organization should be looking at,
yeah.
How would you approach that?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are infinite channels available to us, and I think we need to start with baby steps to a certain degree. What is going to be the most effective channel to reach people, to reach an audience, a captive audience, and to be able to share a story in an effective way for that audience. So maybe as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that what I really mean is start with the people that you know. In many cases with organizations, and that this isn't true across all, but in many cases, it's an older audience that's connected with you. And the reason for that is because that older audience has a disposable income and is willing to give. Now, there's probably another audience in there that's engaged and cares about your mission. But if we're talking from a fundraising perspective, that's probably the makeup, and maybe that's where to start. And so where are these people? A lot of them are in mail. There's no question about it. That's still one of the most effective ways to reach out to your donor audience and drive fundraising. But it's not the only one. So where would we go in the next layer? Email is probably the next place that I would go. So mail, layering on some email there. And then, we all have websites as charities. So that's another piece. How are we, people, when they want to know more about a charity, when a charity reaches out to them, chances are they're not going to that special custom URL you put on the DM pack. They're just searching you on Google. So at the end of the day, they're going to search you on Google, and they're probably going to end up on your website, and what's there that's going to engage them as well, because there's the active kind of the content that we push out, and then there's kind of the intake where people land there and are kind of consuming at their own choice. So you're not directing them entirely. You may have a user journey set up in your site, but for the most part, they're picking and choosing. They're choosing their own adventure to a degree, and so what's there to connect with them with too. So mail, email, your website, those are some natural places to start, but then you do start to layer on. We're doing increasing work in digital media, landing pages, videos. Again, the options are endless. But I think starting and to find your voice in those channels that feel kind of tried, tested, and true seems to me a good bet in getting kind of kicked off.
I love it. I love it. And I mean, look, a note for the organizations working with vulnerable populations out there. I mean, you have options. The challenge that many nonprofits and charities face is that they believe that their story begins and ends with the population that they serve. So if they can't speak to that population specifically, that's really the end of their capacity for storytelling. But the reality is that stories are everywhere in the people who surround your primary population, family and friends, if those are possible, but also caregivers, staff, volunteers, and even donors. All of these people have stories to share. We just need to find those stories so that we can tell them. And through showing the negative space that surrounds your primary population, you can tell their story just as effectively. Well, our 15 minutes are up, and that's a wrap. You stay classy, fundraisers.